Manchester Üniversitesi Öğretim Üyesi Profesör Doktor Mukesh KAPILA ve AFAD Planlama Risk Azaltma Dairesi Başkanı Sayın Abdulkadir TEZCAN, lütfen söz sizde Sayın Özer. Buyurun.
Teşekkürler. Sesle ilgili sorun yok galiba. Devam edebiliriz. Günaydın herkese, iyi günler. Katılımcılarımızdan ikisi İngilizce konuşacakları için ara ara çeviri ben de yapmış olacağım. Bir katılımcımız da AFAD'dan, kendisiyle de Türkçe devam edeceğiz. So, good morning everyone. Welcome to Kızılay's special session on individual resilience and social resilience against disasters. So we all know that disasters are a very important factor that touching to humanity. So people have to be ready for the disasters before it comes and during disaster time as well. So today we will be talking about how it affects humanity when it comes to disasters that we live in this era. So the world is aging, the world is changing. We know that the disasters is with us. So we have it almost every day. Whether we live it or not, we know that around the world there is a number of disasters happening every single day. Today, we have very valuable participants. I would like to introduce them, but before, let me just add just a couple of tiny quick notes as a moderator. We will be having two main parts. So the first part of this session will be about 15 minutes for each participant to talk about your own experience and your own values about the resilience. And then after that, once every participant speaks about their own experience, we'll have the questions and sessions by the audience. Let me first start with myself. My name is İbrahim ÖZER. I am the Deputy Director General for Turkish Red Crescent. I'm responsible for the Disaster Management Department at TRC. Our next speaker is Professor Mukesh KAPILA. He is Professor Emeritus of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs, University of Manchester, UK. He's also a senior advisor to the Parliamentary Assembly to the Mediterranean. Dr. KAPILA is an author, writer, public and media speaker, and has extensive experience in global health, humanitarian affairs, conflict and security, international development, human rights, and diplomacy. He has qualifications in medicine, public health, and development from the University of Oxford and London. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you, and very glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation. You can hear me okay? Yeah. So, what I've been asked to do on this panel on resilience is to try and look back a bit and trace the origins of the phrase and how its meaning has evolved over the time and where it is going now. Now, if you look around the world's problems appear to be multiplying, be they frequent and ferocious disasters or never-ending armed conflicts. And of course, we now have climate change, which itself is accelerating. And the defining feature of modern crises is that they are rapidly transmitted, the shock is rapidly transmitted elsewhere because we live in an interconnected and globalized world. Nothing stays as a disaster or crisis in one place because its echoes are felt everywhere else. And a good example, of course, is the current Russian-Ukrainian war, which has triggered the forced migration of millions of people, a massive energy crisis, and their prospects of serious global hunger. Perhaps, therefore, it's not surprising that the word resilience is becoming fashionable nowadays. Now, in the English language, the word comes from the Latin word resilire, meaning to rebound or recoil. It's interesting that the word arose first in the 17th century at a moment of great European turmoil. In the 17th century, we had the 30-Year War. The Ottoman Empire began its aggressive expansion, and the beginnings of European colonialism also started with the first journeys into America. And further afield, the famines and earthquakes hastened the end of China's ancient Ming dynasty. So it seems that in the 17th century, there was a lot going on. Sometimes we feel a lot is going on in today's world, but of course, in the past, these things also happened. So the word resilience, resiliere, in Latin, came at a time of great global turbulence in the 17th century. And over subsequent centuries, other serious events, disasters, crises, have given different shades of meaning to the resilience term, as also have advances made in our understanding of the physical and social sciences. So, for example, when steel was invented, the concept of resilience was important in terms of measuring the quality of the steel, which was a fundamental part of the Industrial Revolution that powered the connectivity of the world. And these different moments and phases and histories, they consolidated into the modern definition of the word resilience in the Oxford English Dictionary, which simply says, the ability of people or things to recover quickly after something unpleasant, such as a shock or an injury and so on. Now, coming to disaster management, the concept of resilience was better fleshed out around the 2005 World Conference on Disaster Reduction, which took place in Japan. And this conference adopted the Hyogo framework, and among its action points was a call to build a global culture of resilience. And this asked, at the heart of this great call for action for resilience, it was basically asking for a multi-pronged approach to understanding risks, reducing them through spreading awareness, and enhancing preparedness and response. However, note that the conference was taking place in the shocked mood following the massive 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And I recall from being involved both in the tsunami response and the World Conference afterwards, that the focus was driven by a very limited approach. In other words, resilience was equated to reacting to disasters and managing them better. Unfortunately, it meant that in the subsequent years, resilience remained just a catchphrase, a subset of humanitarian response geared towards investing more in disaster response preparedness through, for example, early warning systems, stockpiling relief supplies, and better training for first responders. In fact, the ISDR itself, ISDR is the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, was itself only a part of the UN's own humanitarian department, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. And the head of OCHA, the Undersecretary General, was so busy firefighting, traveling around the world fighting disasters, he had no time left for disaster reduction and preparedness. So that was the climate at as late as 2005, 2006. Now, I recall myself at that time as a major donor to I was at that time the head of humanitarian affairs in the UK government's Department for International Development, now part of the Foreign Office. And I suggested that we should earmark 10% of my very large disaster response budget towards disaster reduction. But I was heavily criticized by the emergency response lobby, including, by the way, the Red Cross, who said that I was being cruel by taking money away from life-saving assistance and taking money away from desperately needed people who were suffering from emergency in order to spend it on preparing for future emergencies. So even though what we were trying to do was to create a formula to benchmark preparedness and reduction to the actual volume of disasters. So in other words, the more disasters happened, the more we should be spending on reducing them. And that was the argument at that time, but people were not interested. This is because the humanitarian lobby was very powerful, and they didn't want their budgets to be touched, if you like. So humanitarians were not the very most principled supporters of the resilience agenda at that time because they had a selfish interest. They were only interested in emergency relief. But in the end, we got our way, and so then started a tradition of putting a proportion, 10% of humanitarian response budgets to be earmarked for reduction. And gradually, this became something of a norm, reflected, for example, in UN and Red Cross, Red Crescent emergency appeals. Unfortunately, what happened next was that those additional funds were hijacked towards disaster response preparedness and management, and not genuine risk and vulnerability reduction. As such, they contributed very little to genuine resilience building. And thus, as late as 2010s, roughly speaking, no more than 10 years ago, the mindset of humanitarian lobby was still focused on tackling disasters. At the heart of this policy war or policy divide was a tussle between development and humanitarian people. That division is quite sharp. The two sides operated in their own parallel universe, and this was the age of the Millennium Development Goals. I hope you've heard of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. And the MDGs made little, if any, reference to disasters and crises. So the debate was that is the reduction of crises and hazards a humanitarian issue, or is it a development issue? And the answer depended not on any rational logic, but on the bureaucratic division between humanitarian and development budget lines and staffing in government ministries, international organizations. But then the World Bank came along. And the World Bank has much greater intellectual resource and convening power compared to the UN. And they created the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery in 2006. Now, I had the privilege to serve as an advisor to them, and we were able to bring a more modern concept of resilience to the forefront. The trigger was a recognition that more and more of the investments made by the World Bank were getting damaged and destroyed. So the schools they built, the bridges and roads they built, the health infrastructure they created, that was being ruined by disasters. And repairing or replacing them was costly. Even insurance companies were beginning to complain that the insurance premiums were too little and the damage and losses they had to pay was too much at that time. So, and the world was worried that the primary mission of development was being hijacked by the losses that were happening as a consequence of the disasters. And this couldn't go on. It was irresponsible not to disaster-proof future development. And so emerged new approaches to project design, building in greater robustness to resist future disasters, right from the very beginning. So the World Bank's leadership basically settled the debate on whether disaster reduction and resilience was a humanitarian issue or a development matter. Obviously, it was the latter. And since then, it is development and not humanitarian programs that have become the principal conduit for investment in resilience building. When the flawed MDGs finally finished in 2015, they were replaced by the more comprehensive sustainable development goals. A new dimension of sustainability was introduced into the resilience definition. You know, previously, as I mentioned earlier, we had talked about resilience as rebounding or recovering from a disaster. But restoring the past, the status quo ante, to be destroyed again by the next disaster was just foolish. After all, crises are also opportunities. Hence, resilience language now started including the notion of building back better and emerging stronger. In other words, doing what we do more endurably and sustainably. Of course, what started concentrating our minds was accelerating climate change, as well as global trends such as forced migration and urbanization. Now, these phenomena also force us to recognize that regardless of the billions we can throw away at disaster-proofing our physical assets, this is not going to be enough in the face of multiple and interconnected shocks in our multiply stressed world. We just don't have enough resources and capacities to mitigate all the natural and man-made disasters that are hitting us all the time. Indeed, a lot of countries like Afghanistan or the Horn and the Sahel in Africa are in recurrent or permanent crisis. We call them fragile states. So the resilience concept is beginning to go beyond the physical robustness of our houses, roads, electricity, and water supplies. Equally, perhaps even more significantly, the dimensions of policy resilience, institutional resilience, and community and personal resilience are getting important. So policy resilience is about the courage of politicians and decision makers to change their minds and alter or even reverse course if facts and circumstances dictate. And climate response policies will be a much bigger test of policy resilience in coming years. Institutional resilience is what service providers, like the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and others, and these service providers ensuring business continuity in the face of shocks. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has humbled all of us and crashed all our systems, including for health. Very quickly, this happened. Obviously, our institutions were not resilient to anything. A little virus comes along, and within months, the whole world, the systems have collapsed. What kind of resilience is that? That's why the World Health Organization is nowadays talking more about resilient health systems and not just strong health systems. A big current challenge to institutional resilience nowadays are criminal cyber attacks that is requiring a whole re-engineering of the controls and communications behind the systems that enable our daily function. The water supply that supplies this town, our electricity systems, and everything else in between. Community resilience is about harnessing the collective capabilities of all of us to tackle a shared problem. And remember, today's definition of a community is not just people who live in a village or town. For example, people who share a common interest but live on the other corner of the world are part of that community of shared interests. So community is not just a geographical concept. It is a mindset concept. So this is evident in many ways. In this community resilience, of course, we all know about in towns and neighborhoods, professional associations, and so on. Now, community resilience doesn't require on a feeling of solidarity alone. It relies on selfishness, on mutual self-interest. So there you are, you see, this is at the core of humanitarianism, where solidarity and self-interest actually come together. So resilience in the community sense actually is both a mutual benefit objective, a very selfish objective. At the same time, it's an altruistic objective. And being aware of that is very important in designing community strategies. Now, the Red Cross, Red Crescent has been, of course, at the forefront of developing theory and practice in this particular area. And at the core of their work is this notion using voluntarism to build social capital in communities that can be drawn upon in crisis. It's just like when you save money when you are in good times and you save money and put it in the bank. And then when you need the money, you go to the bank and you get out the money and buy what you need, right? So similarly, social capital is like that, really. In good times, you build the social capital of a community, and in bad times, you draw down that capital from the social bank and use it to keep your community going. And resilience is a very important manifestation. That's really what we mean by community resilience. However, in conclusion, all these different domains of resilience that I have described ultimately rely on only on one thing, and that is personal or individual resilience. You and I each have our own personal and individual resilience. We know this well, and as a doctor, I know this well from my clinical practice in the past. We know this well in mental health problems. in ordinary life. But we also know this in the mental health problem among stress or trauma-affected people. For example, after the tsunami, or now among millions who are witnessing bloody conflict, losing everything and getting displaced in Ukraine, or the people of Tigray who have been enduring a terrible blockade, famine, rape, and many times a brutal assault in Ethiopia. They're surviving. They're dying, but they're also surviving. They're surviving through summoning up their coping capacities, personal coping capacities, what we may call resilience. Nevertheless, such experiences that traumatize the whole of society makes recovery very difficult because this depends on the robustness of individual as well as collective social healing. So personal healing and social healing are also very much part of the concept of resilience. You know, resilience, the definition of resilience is now like the definition of an elephant. An elephant, it's difficult to define an elephant. Do you describe an elephant by its legs, its trunk, whatever? But everyone knows what an elephant looks like. If you see an elephant in front of you, you'll say, ah, that's an elephant. So the concept of resilience is a bit like this. It's a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of the other. But when you see resilience, you know it's resilience, if you like. That's why we should not get hung up on definitions too much. Therefore, in final conclusion, let me say that resilience is not simply a disaster issue or a health issue or a social issue, but it's a political issue. And in our stressed world where we are simply fighting each other for all sorts of issues, not just active war, but in all the other competitions that are there among us, geopolitical, for resources, and so on and so on forth. We're not going to be able to overcome these horrors of division unless we have the courage and capacity to move on. Therefore, there is also a spiritual dimension to this word resilience. Otherwise, our populations, our world, we are doomed to repeated cycles of violence and discontent, as we see in so many prolonged conflict places such as Syria or in Yemen. So finally, we have come a long way since the early simplistic notion of resilience to now seeing it in all its dimensions: physical, social, mental, organizational, and political. That being said, what is the core essence of it? What is the kind of core meaning in it, if you like? You know, from my own 30, 40 years of experience, I would say it's one thing, and that is surplus. But what do I mean by surplus? What I mean is, if you look at examples of successful resilience, whether it's to be to disasters or survivors after a war or to any other situation, it comes down to whether or not individuals and their families have got a little bit of reserve in them in the good times to be able to deploy them in the bad times to survive, right? That's why the reduction of poverty in the world, to give each individual a little bank account, a little reserve through which they can fight the bad times, is a fundamental part of actually having a culture of resilience, a world. And that means basically in the end development is the answer, really. And at the end of it, the meaning of resilience is to appear stronger, more robust, both as individuals and as societies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukesh. I think it was great that you take us back to the history to better understand the root of resilience and how it evolves in time. Thanks a lot for that again. So our next panelist is Jonathan Brass. Jonathan is a humanitarian and development expert with a specialist background in food security, livelihoods, and economic security. Over 2 decades of experience providing support to vulnerable and displaced populations affected by the conflict and natural disaster in more than 45 countries. Specializing in cash preparedness, market-based approaches to humanitarian response, and capacity development. He's currently in Turkey, managing the largest humanitarian program globally, the Emergency Social Safety Net, in short that we know it by ESSN. Welcome, Jonathan. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Distinguished panelists, participants, it's lovely to be here. My goodness, it's quite difficult to follow Professor Mukesh, but it's great to have that lavish history and understanding of what do we mean by resilience. If you don't mind, I would just start with, what is IFRC? The International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies is the largest humanitarian organization globally. It has it has 192 members, of which are called national societies, which cut across the globe. And they play an important role for each of their governments. They're an auxiliary to their national government. They may play a health role, they may be a part of the first response, they may be disaster responders. But ultimately, we're all driven by 7 binding or unifying principles. One of them is humanity, focusing on humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity, and universality. This is what binds us as these different 192 organizations under this membership. We also play a bit of a role in managing resilience. So what is resilience? I mean, quite simply, for the IFRC, it's like this elastic band. It's the ability to be able to adapt to stress and to strain, and then to be able to respond to those stresses. We have an approach which we focus on. We heard from Dr. Mukesh that there's global resilience, all the way down to individual resilience. And really, as an organization, we focus specifically on community resilience approaches. We believe in the power of localization. We believe in the importance of strengthening volunteer networks, utilizing local capacities, and an emphasis on very much community preparedness. So what is the role? What is the role of IFRC when we are working with this community preparedness approach, this approach to developing resilient communities? The first is recognizing a social cohesive community is a resilient community, supporting them from a social cohesive perspective. This could be anything from supporting different communities with different languages being able to work together, helping through economic means. So bringing together that social cohesion, that is critical in a resilient community. The next is having economic opportunity. If there's not an economic opportunity within a resilient community, we will begin to see this separation or this division of this particular community. The next is access to well-maintained services and infrastructure. Obviously, the government of each country is the primary duty bearer, but being able to get the access, whether it's physical access to markets, or whether it's access to education or health services, where an additional support is needed to get into those schools. For example, many children or many parents, they have access to free education, but the school books or clothing for children prevent them from being able to access that education for their kids. Managing those natural assets is key. Again, a resilient community is able to manage its own national assets. Without ability to be able to manage its own national assets, it again begins to crumble. And importantly for the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, connectiveness, the ability to be connected is critical for a resilient community. And it's the role of IFRC to work with national societies to support which particular area, which emphasis do they want to place in terms of supporting that particular community. Obviously, as I mentioned, it's a large national organization. It has a long history, but from this, I think we can take three main lessons on what is a resilient community and how do we support it. The first is addressing the underlying vulnerabilities of that particular community and doing it in a way which is risk-informed, is utilizing data to understand those risks. And as rightly mentioned, here in Turkey, one perfect example for us is the delivery of the emergency social safety net. It's here supporting 1.5 million people under international temporary protection. That's over 250,000 families on a monthly basis, is receiving a basic needs handout in order to address that economic vulnerability. They are then also linked into the ability to have their needs referred. If they have protection needs, they're able to be referred to other institutions. If they have particular desires to actually move into more sustainable livelihood opportunity, there is referral elements there. So really this ability to understand the situation, analyze the big data, and be able to do the assessments to inform the underlying vulnerabilities affected by a community, and reacting to that is critical. And here, as I mentioned, we're doing this with the Turkish Red Crescent, with the Ministry of Family and Labour Social Services, in order to deliver this monthly assistance to those affected under international and temporary protection. The second really big learning is having a demand-driven approach and be people-centered. I mean, that's, again, critical. Here in Turkey, we have two main focuses. One is that we utilize community centers. We have, obviously, the branches which cut across the country, hundreds and hundreds of branches with their volunteer networks. But in addition, we have these specialized community centers where people can go to demand skill development, to demand language, demand protection services, to just have that interaction. And it's not just for the foreigners in country, it's a space where foreigners and the local community to come and interact and share and express their feelings over the situation that they're in. Further to that, there's a need to have that communication. And here, again, we have something called a 168 number, a phone number, a free call number. It's that simple. But where anyone and everyone can pick up the phone, call 168, even if you don't know Turkish language, it's in 6 different other languages. People can pick up the phone, be able to ask questions, understand how can they get access to those services. So that ability to be able to listen and then react to what we're hearing is a critical part of the role we play in terms of supporting community resilience. And finally, and I think I've been rather quick, but hey, it gives them more chance for questions and reflections. The third is really about being connected. Again, connected, not just connected between each other, but how the national society connects with the local population. Whether it's about campaigns, we ran a really important campaign during the COVID times, explaining the processes, explaining some of the cleaning, hand washing habits, mask wearing habits relating to COVID. So really that ability to communicate. Also, being that close with the communities. Blood banks is, again, a really important area which a national society works on being able to really link and be a part of that community. Further to this, as I mentioned, the elastic band. What happens when the elastic band snaps? There needs to be a way in which we're able to support those individuals whose resilience is broken. And again, we have the ability to respond to those needs. Whether recently we had the wildfires last year, again, Turkish Red Crescent at the forefront of supporting that through its volunteer networks. Earthquakes here in Turkey are sadly quite predominant. Again, recently, in Izmir, there was the earthquake. Again, first on the ground, our Turkish Red Crescent and its volunteers providing a variety of services. Cold snaps. Ultimately, even though we're talking about resilient communities and what makes a resilient communities are those 5 areas of social cohesiveness, economic opportunity, access to well-maintained services, management of national assets, and its connectiveness, is also having a safety net around you, which, if your resilience is broken, that there is an institution like the Turkish Red Crescent here in Turkey, which is able to immediately respond and support those needs of those vulnerable. I will leave it at that. I'm very proud to have the opportunity to be here, and please, if there are further follow-ups, I'll be more than happy to mention them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was great to hear about IFRC's perspective on resilience and your experience. And I just personally wanted to add that I am very delighted to be part of the greatest, enormous family of IFRC. So thank you for being us today as well. The next participant, Abdulkadir TEZCAN. Şimdi Türkçe'ye dönüş yapacağım buradan sonra. If you allow me, I will be switching to Turkish. Abdulkadir TEZCAN lisans öğrenimini Ankara Üniversitesi Fizik Mühendisliği bölümünde, yüksek lisansını ise Gazi Üniversitesi Fizik bölümünde tamamladı. Ankara Büyükşehir Belediyesi bünyesinde farklı kademelerde yönetici olarak çalıştı. 2018 yılından itibaren İçişleri Bakanlığı, Afet ve Acil Durum Yönetimi Başkanlığı yani AFAD'da daire başkanı olarak devam etmektedir. Özellikle Türk, Kızılay'ı ve AFAD'ın sahada çok yoğun bir birlikte çalışmaları da var. Biz Abdulkadir Bey'le de çok yoğun şekilde çalışıyoruz. Türkiye'de 99 depreminden sonra gelişen, değişen farklı bir afet yaklaşımı meydana gelmişti. AFAD'la birlikte bu biraz daha renklenmeye, şekillenmeye başlandı. Benim kişisel olarak hatırladığım Elazığ depreminden sonra kurumların birbiriyle sahada çok yoğun bir çalışmasının örneğiydi. Zannedersem ilk örneklerden birisi olabilir Elazığ depremi. Burada hem kurumlar nezdinde hem Türkiye'de bireysel ve toplumsal afet dirençliliği ile ilgili AFAD'ın zaten çok yoğun çalışmaları var. İRAP çalışmaları, TARAP çalışmaları, bizler de o işin bir parçasıyız sahada, yerelde. Bu bağlamda ben şimdi sözü size bırakıyorum Abdulkadir Bey. Buyurun.
Sesim geliyor. Öncelikle Kızılay Genel Müdür Yardımcımız İbrahim Bey'e, kıymetli hocamıza, kıymetli sivil toplum örgütümüzün yöneticisine ve işte burada şu an Kocaeli İl AFAD Müdürüm var, kıymetli katılımcılar, hepinize ayrı ayrı teşekkürlerimi sunmak istiyorum. Kıymetli bir organizasyon, dirençlilik, biraz önce bir elindeki lastikle göstermiş olduğu görselin tam manasıyla aslında vücut bulmuş hali ve bir şekilde anlamlandıracaksak doğru gösterim tarzlarından bir tanesi. Resilience kelimesinin karşılığı bizde dirençlilik, dayanım, işte mukavemet, birçok farklı kavramla şey yapılabilir ama Türkçe'de dirençlilikle özdeşleştirmeye çalışıldı. Hocam zamanının yani dirençlik kavramını tam manasıyla anlattı. Sivil toplum örgütü açısından nelerle içeriyor? Ben de sizlere afetlere karşı başlığı olduğu için afetlere karşı bireysel ve kentsel dirençliliğin ülkemizdeki bakış açısı ne? Ülkemizde bu nasıl bir yönetim tarzı işleniyor? Ve biz aslında bunun için neler yapıyoruz? En azından onu ortaya koymak isterim. Türkiye'de AFAD 2009 yılında kurulduktan sonra afetlere bütünleşik bakış açısı dediğimiz, afetin sadece müdahalesine odaklı değil, afet anına odaklı değil, afetin öncesi risk azaltıcı, afet sonrası iyileştirmeyi içeren ve afetin aslında tamamını başından sonuna olmadan önce olduktan sonrasıyla beraber değerlendiren bir bakış açısı söz konusu. Ve bunun için biraz önce İbrahim Bey de söylediler, Elazığ depremi gibi, Düzce seli gibi, işte en son Rize'deki sel gibi, orman yangınları gibi, peşine Kastamonu'daki sel gibi birçok son dönemde yaşadığımız afetlerdeki o hızlı ve etkin mücadelenin ve bir an evvel sahada yer alabilmenin rolü buradan geliyor. Bu güç şöyle bir planlamayı gerektiriyor ki dirençliğin asıl önemli unsurlarından bir tanesi doğru planlamayı yapabilmek. Doğru planlamadaki unsurlardan Türkiye'de 2013 yılında afetlerle coğrafi olarak çok fazla maruz kalan, hatta afetin her türüne maruz kalan ülkelerden bir tanesiyiz. Çünkü birçok ülkede farklı afet türleri yaşanırken bizim ülkemizde aynı anda geçen yazın gördüğümüz gibi bir yanda selleri, güney kısmımızda yangınları, tekrar selleri, bir tarafta depremi, bir tarafta işte obrukları, bir tarafta başka bütün afet türlerini ki son dönemde geçen yıl 81 ilimizde il afet risk azaltma planlarımızı bitirdik. Her il için ayrı ayrı. Burada 23 farklı afet türü çalışmış durumdayız. 23 farklı afet türü hakkında çalışmalar gerçekleştirildi. Ve bu aslında ne kadar afetselliğinin yüksek olduğunu ve ne kadar çok afete maruz kalabileceğimizin göstergesi. Bu ortadayken 2009 yılında kurulmuş bir kurum olarak 2013 yılında Türkiye Afet Müdahale Planı devreye alındı. Bu plan öyle bir plan ki bir afet olduğu anda kim, hangi pozisyonda, nerede, ne iş yapacak, sorumlulukları ve sorumluları belirleyen bir plan. Ve afet anındaki o yönetsel duruşun hiçbir noktasını boş bırakmayan bir plan. Güvenliğimiz, trafiğimiz şuradan sorumlu. Psikososyal buradan sorumlu. Arama kurtarma buradan sorumlu. Kızılay beslenmemizden sorumlu. İşte tahliye yerleştirmeden şu kurumumuz sorumlu. Aklınıza ne geliyorsa, afet anında barınmamızdan şurası sorumlu. Buna ait ne yapılması gerekiyorsa, tek tek planlanmış, tek tek afet olmadan önce masaya yatırılmış, sadece o kuruma değil, onun ihtiyaç duyabileceği destek çözüm ortaklarıyla beraber masada tartışılmış ve yönetsel olarak afet olduğunda efendim ben ne yapayım sorusunun yerine kimin ne yapacağının belli olduğu bir plan. Ve bu plan sayesinde 2013'ten ki bazen planlar içselleştirilmesi zor konulardır. Bu konuda ülkemiz o genç nüfusunun vermiş olduğu dinamizmle de hızlı bir şekilde bunu kavramış ve son yıllardaki o hızlı müdahale ve etkin müdahalede bunu kullanmış. Geldiğimiz noktada gerçekten kurumlarımız, kuruluşlarımız bu konuda ellerinden geldiği kadar ne yapabiliyorlarsa kapasite artırarak, bugünden o ihtiyaçları görerek bu konuda hazırlık yürütmekteler. Bunu tabii ki başka sistemlerle destekliyoruz. Biraz önce hocalarımız da söyledi. Gönüllülük sistemi. Gönüllülük sisteminde şu ana kadar AFAD'ın E-Devlet üzerinden gönüllüleri kabulünü yapıyoruz. 450 bin gönüllümüz başvurmuş durumda. Bu gönüllülerimiz bizim orada ortaya koyduğumuz eğitimler var. Böyle kısa kısa her konuda küçük küçük eğitimler vermeye çalışıyoruz afetler konusunda. Ve verdiğimiz eğitimler neticesinde belli bir seviyeyi aştıktan sonra da diyoruz ki yüz yüze eğitime gelin. Gelin beraber sahada beraber olalım. Bunun haricinde sivil toplum kuruluşlarımıza diyoruz ki efendim arama kurtarmada çalışmak istiyorsunuz, beslenme alanında çalışmak istiyorsunuz, diğer alanlarda aynı bağış depo yönetimi olur, psikososyal çalışma alanı olur. Hangisinde çalışmak istiyorsanız bununla ilgili akreditasyonu yayınladık. Ve diyoruz ki gelecekseniz beraber çalışacaksak belli bir standarta sahip olun. Ve o standart çerçevesinde biz sizinle sahada görev alalım. Çünkü sahaya geliyorlar, afet anı her türlü tehlikeye açık olduğunuz andır. Çünkü iyi niyetli insanlar da olabilir, art niyetli insanlar da olabilir. Siz o nedenle sahada daha önce çalıştığınız, bildiğiniz, daha önce yorumladığınız, tatbikatlarla desteklediğiniz insanların bir arada olmasını istersiniz. O nedenle geçen yıl eğitim yılı ilan edilmişti. Türkiye'de afet farkındalık eğitimi hedefimiz 51 milyondu. 56 milyon vatandaşımıza afet farkındalık eğitimi verdik. Bu yıl afet tatbikat yılı. Çünkü geçen yıl eğitimlerle insanlara bir bilinç kazandırmıştık. Bu sene tatbikatlarla tatbik edebilme, öğrendiklerimizi ortaya koyabilme adına çok önemli bir süreç başlattık. Ve şu ana kadar geçen ay içerisindeydi herhalde, 4'ünde miydi? 4'ünde Türkiye'deki tüm okullarda, ilköğretim, ortaöğretim, lise tamamında tahliye tatbikatı yaptık. Ve şu an hedefimiz 54 bin tatbikat yapmaktı. Neredeyse 52 binden fazla tatbikat gerçekleştirilmiş durumda. Hali hazırda yangın tatbikatları, diğer tatbikatlar, taşkın tatbikatları, deprem tatbikatları tamamıyla ilgili tatbikat yapmaya devam ediyoruz. Buradaki o dirençlik kavramında önemli olan şeylerden bir tanesi de sürdürülebilirlikti. Yani afet oluyordu, olduktan sonra sizin işletmeniz veya işte kritik altyapılarımız onlar zarar görebilirdi. Ama önemli olan bunu da bir plan dahilinde bir an evvel normale döndürmek. Bir an evvel o eski çalışabildiği haline olmuyorsa en az asgari zararla neyi atlatabiliyorsak işimizin devam edebilmesi. Çünkü zarar gören kuruluş bir gıda kuruluşu olabilir, bir enerji kuruluşu olabilir, bir kritik tesisimiz olabilir, hastanelerimiz, işte emniyet binalarımız birçok şey olabilir. Bunlar bir an evvel nasıl eski haline dönmeli? O nedenle müdahalenin yanında Türkiye Afet Müdahale Planı ile güzel bir çalışma yürütmüştük. Dedik ki risk azaltalım. Çünkü risk azaltmak aslında sizi afetler olmadan önce güvenli noktaya taşıyor. Ve bununla ilgili özellikle iş sürekliliği planlarımız. Organize sanayi bölgeleriyle beraber ortak çalışıyoruz. Kocaeli de bunlardan bir tanesi. Kocaeli OSB pilot bölgelerimizden bir tanesiydi. Kocaeli OSB'mizle de çalıştık. İş sürekliliği planları. Ardından büyük endüstriyel kazalarımızın toksit yayılımı nasıl olmalı? Buna ait milli yazılımlar gerçekleştiriyoruz. Ardından kritik altyapılar. Kritik altyapılarda bir an evvel tekrar sektörler nasıl devam edebilir? Nerede devam edebilir? Bunları ortaya koyabilmek. Bu manada ben risk azaltıcı faaliyetlerin gerçekten afetlerin müdahalesinde daha önce müdahale daire başkanlığı yapmış bir kardeşiniz olarak söylüyorum. Daha önemli ve daha kıymetli. Çünkü riski azaltabilirsek tüm dünyanın kabul ettiği bir gerçek var. Mal ve can kayıplarınızı bir tarafa tutuyorum. Onun bir maddi bedeli yok. Ancak mal kayıplarınızın, ekonomik kayıplarınızın, iş kayıplarınızın daha aza indirgenmesi açısından çok fazla önemli. Dünya genelinde kabul görmüş, Sendai çerçevesinde de ortaya konmuş bir gerçek var. Deniyor ki afet öncesi yapacağınız bir birimlik yatırım, afet anında gerçekleştireceğiniz 7 birimlik yatırıma tekabül etmektedir. Ancak biz bunu şu an afetlerin ekonomik etkisi de hesaplama çalışmalarımız devam ediyor. Bazı afetlerde 1'e 7 değil, 1'e 10, 1'e 15, 1'e 20 olduğunu da gördüğümüz yerler oluyor. O nedenle afetler olmadan önce yapılan yatırımlar, afetler olmadan önce göstereceğiniz planlama, çalışmalar ve dirençli hale getirme çalışmaları bizim için çok kıymetli. İl afet risk azaltma planlarını 81 ilde, 99 üniversiteden 289 akademisyenimizle, tüm kurum ve kuruluşlarımızla, sivil toplum kuruluşlarımızla, şehrin ileri gelenleriyle beraber hazırladık. Ve herkes kendi ilindeki afetsellik neyse ortaya koydu. O afet türlerine göre ne yaparsak bu afetten daha az etkileniriz veya ne yaparsak bu afetin etkilerini bertaraf ederiz tartıştı. SWOT analizleriyle bunu tartıştık. Ve ortaya konan bu tartışmalar neticesinde de ilgili kurum ve kuruluşlarla hedef, amaç ve eylemler ortaya koyduk. Şu ana kadar ülkemizde toplamda 12.580 eylem ortaya konmuş durumda ve bunu 5.150 farklı kurum ve kuruluşla beraber çalıştık. Ortaya konan bu eylemler şunu ortaya koyacak, vadeleri de belli. Bir an evvel başlayalım, bir an evvel işte gördüğümüz herhangi bir eksiklik, bir dere yatağı olabilir, bir orman yolu olabilir, bir başka afet türü bir endüstriyel tesis olabilir. Ne yapılması gerekiyorsa bugünden önlemini alalım ve afetler meydana gelmeden önce gerekli tedbirleri ortaya koyup aslında afetler, o doğa olayları bir şekilde aslında olmaya devam ediyor. En azından oradan en az can ve mal kaybıyla nasıl çıkarız onun bilincini ortaya koymak. Şu an bir üst çatı belgesi olan Türkiye Afet Risk Azaltma Planımız da hazırlandı. En üst makama onaya sunulmuş durumda. Onun hazırlıklarıyla beraber peşine iyileştirmeye dair afet sonrası iyileştirmek ki yine Sendai'nin önceliklerinden bir tanesi daha iyisini inşa et. Yani bir afet gerçekleşti, yapacağınız artık yeni yatırımlar artık o afet türlerini de göz önüne alarak daha iyisini, daha doğrusunu inşa ederek devam etmeli. Üst çatı belgemiz olan Türkiye Afet Yönetim Stratejisiyle de bir gerçekliği ve bu konuda gerçekten birçok ülkeye örnek olabilecek belgeler, örnek olabilecek nitelikte çalışmalar yürütüyoruz. Vaktimi de aşmak istemem çünkü sorular olursa da almak isteriz. Ancak dirençlilik kavramının çok global, çok genel bir kavram olduğunu, afetlerde dirençliliğin ise bunun altında çok önemli olduğunu, yani çünkü eğer afetlere karşı dirençliliğiniz yoksa birçok noktada işte o gücünüzü ortaya koyamıyorsanız geriye dönmeniz, o biraz önce o lastiğin kopması gibi, eğer lastik koparsa bir daha geri dönemeyecek, geri dönmeyecek. Geriye dönebilmemizi hızlandırmak adına o dirençliğimizi, o esnek yapımızı artırmak zorundayız. Ben tekrar bizi davet ettiğiniz için hem Kocaeli Belediyesi'ne hem Kızılay'ımıza ayrı ayrı teşekkür ediyorum. Katılımcılara da şükranlarımı sunuyorum. Sağ olun.
Çok teşekkürler Abdülkadir Bey. Özellikle AFAD'ın son zamanlarda yaptığı çalışmalar İRAP ve TERAP noktasında afet risklerini azaltma ile ilgili ve dirençliliği arttırma ile ilgili biraz da geniş kapsamlı bir bilgilendirme oldu. Çok teşekkürler tekrar. Now I'd like to turn to the audience to see if there's any questions. Herhangi bir katılımcımıza, panelistimize sorularınız varsa buyurun lütfen sorunuz ve kime işaret ediyorsanız alabilirsek. Buyurun. Mikrofon alalım.
Sorumu Türkçe olarak yönelteceğim. Sayın Profesör'e soru sormak istiyorum. Toplumsal direnç bağlamında aslında kronolojik bir anlatı gerçekleştirdiniz. Teşekkür ediyoruz bunun için. Afet hazırlık ve önleme çalışmalarına ilişkin olarak toplumsal direnç bağlamında gönüllü olmayı nasıl tanımlarsınız? Ben kendimi de tanıtmak isterim. Türkiye Kızılay Derneği'nde, Kızılay'da gönüllülük departmanında çalışıyorum şu anda. Dolayısıyla sizin gönüllülük bağlamındaki yaklaşımınızı da merak ediyorum ve bu bağlamda yine gönüllülüğün toplumsal dirence olan etkisinin yanı sıra psikolojik sağlamlılık, gönüllülük ve bu doğrultuda toplumda pozitif ya da negatif olarak ortaya çıkan ve dünya gündemine yeni düşen, tartışma oluşturan sosyal etki kavramını nasıl tanımlarsınız? Sizin yaklaşımınız nedir?
Another lecture?
Yeah.
I think firstly starting from volunteering, the concept is highly abused nowadays. And especially for poor communities, it is a code word for labor exploitation and for misuse. So it's very important that voluntarism, which is really a person doing something without any consideration of any remuneration or reward, is not used improperly. Voluntarism has to be spontaneous. It can be organized. This is what the Red Crescent does all the time, if you like. But I think too many countries and governments, if I may say so, abuse that as a substitute for the lack of providing government services in a way. So, but each society and community must find its own spontaneous way of voluntarism. At one level, of course, if you over-organize voluntarism, you destroy it. And this is the dilemma that I think all organizations faced. How do you regulate and organize, but don't police it to such an extent that it becomes just like another army where you join a cadre in a way. So I think on coming to your point about communities, modern communities are very, very different, as I was saying earlier on. So today, for example, if you live in a big city like Istanbul, I'm not really sure what the community is in Istanbul. But it may well be that the community in Istanbul is not where you live, but with whom you associate. So, for example, if you happen to be a teacher, then your community is your fellow teachers, not which geographical place you live in. And I think many social welfare organizations have not recognized that. They're still operating, including the Red Cross, Red Crescent, they're operating in very fixed units, if you like, this branch here, that unit there. That's very old-fashioned nowadays. Today, community is defined by whoever you wish to belong to. And the second aspect is that we belong to several communities simultaneously. So it's not, you don't say, I'm in that community, therefore I'm excluded from that community. And the form of organization, therefore, of modern communities with its multi-dimensional identities, that organizational form and management form is still quite kind of sophisticated, that people have not really developed it. I'm not sure I've addressed all your points, but these are just the thoughts that some of your questions raised for me.
Thank you. Başka soru var mı?
An additional,
please,
additional point.
Sure.
It's an interesting question, and it sort of maybe slightly goes off the topic of resilience fully. But I remember when I first started, I was a volunteer for 2 years. I was thrown into a mountain village in the middle of Honduras. I wondered where in Africa Honduras was before I realized it was Central America. I mean, there was a time where you do give up. And so in terms of, at that point, and I'm sure in your career, it's about experiences. It's about trying to gain those experiences whilst at the same time giving your energy. No, us older men were a bit less energetic. But also giving your experiences and your energy, but to get those experiences. Then on the other side, there's really the volunteering relating to humanity, meaning that something has happened, you need to give. You need to stand up and support. And so that's where the Red Cross, Red Crescent is excellent, because it does have that network where you can, at that moment where you want to give because you're feeling some connection with those affected by the wildfires or those connected, the Syrian crisis. There you have, and you can work through a network which does already exist, and you can join that network. So really it depends on your motivations, whether it's about your personal experiences or whether it's about providing back those specific humanity, which is often so needed. Thank you.
Thank you for the addition. Thanks a lot. Okay, any more questions? Başka sorumuz var mı? One more question, okay. Go on, please.
Sorumu yine Türkçe olarak soracağım. Diyor Jonathan. İklim değişikliğinin Ifrc'nin ana gündeminde olduğunu biliyoruz. Hatta 2022 ve 2025'e kadar stratejik planlarında ilk sırada yer aldığını görüyoruz. İklim değişikliğiyle mücadele çalışmalarının. İESSN programından bahsettiniz. Türkiye'de nasıl ilerlediğini kapsamlıca anlattınız. Bu anlamda iklim değişikliğiyle mücadele çalışmalarında Ifrc olarak ulusal derneklerin gönüllü yapılarına yönelik bir saha çalışması planınız, aksiyon durumunuz nedir? Bu iklim değişikliğiyle mücadele çalışmalarınızın önleme çalışmaları bağlamında, toplumda direnç oluşturma çalışmaları bağlamında nasıl ilerleyeceğine dair bir yol haritası çalışıyor mu federasyon şu anda gönüllü yapılara yönelik olarak? Teşekkür ederim.
Oh, you probably have a better answer.
I think we should have her on the panel.
That's right.
I mean,
well, next time.
we could have had some gender balance also.
We would definitely have the volunteerism and resilience at the same time, WR.
Oh my goodness, how to answer that question? I'm not even sure I'm the best qualified, but I can maybe pass it over as well in terms of how institutions look towards climate change. Of course, climate change, and it was mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, is really at the top of everyone's agendas, whether it's because resilient communities, you need to be resilient to something, and often in many, especially Eastern African countries or countries affected by drought or affected by natural disaster, they're only worsening because of the climate situation. When it comes to, again, volunteerism, I can barely say it, or voluntary service, it really depends on each of the countries in which you work. For example, the Ifrc isn't an organization which would take volunteers from one country and bring it to another country, to another country. This does happen, but much more in a coordinated way when disasters happen. So, for example, the British Red Cross, it will have a team of experts who are ready on standby to go to Ukraine and be there to provide that additional support. Turkish Red Crescent as well. It has a team of international experts ready to go overseas. But that's slightly different to volunteerism. In this case, we're really talking about those networks in our home countries which are built on particularly the branches, particularly built on the core areas of expertise of that national society. Now, as you mentioned, climate change, in some cases, that really is a focus because communities are heavily affected. In other places, it's less of a focus, and maybe it's more of a tree planting exercise. it really depends on each of the national society and a particular priority. And again, going back to what we mentioned before, listening to the communities and having that demand-driven approach is what would then define whether climate change really is at the top of people's agendas. Thank you.
I think you have to distinguish between climate change adaptation or reduction. I mean, for example, what individuals can do to reduce the climate factors that cause the vulnerability is a different set of actions, right? And then the adaptation, which is the first thing people will do, you know, when you are flooded or when you have your forest fire, there, of course, the response is it's irrelevant whether it's due to climate change or any other factor. Now, the question is whether voluntarism and social capital building is the most important dimensions of creating a social movement, or are there better ways of doing this? You know, and this is where, of course, in Red Cross people will always talk about bottom up, because that is how they're indoctrinated. When they're Red Cross babies and they're drinking the Red Cross milk from their Red Cross mothers' mouths, they are all taught about this, you see. But sometimes top-down approaches are necessary in order to stimulate bottom-up reactions. And the question of leadership comes in. And this is where we are now at the state of the world where the top and the bottom and how they relate to each other become quite an important political and cultural point as well on what to do to change society. And climate change, I think, is opening up this debate. I don't know the answer to your question other than to say that traditional approaches to community building, traditional approaches to voluntarism, traditional approaches to all that aren't going to be enough in this business.
That's right. All right, I think we are almost to the end. We already passed the time. Okay, last time, if you don't have any more questions, then we'll, just...
Otherwise, your spokeswoman will...
can answer your questions as well. Well, thank you so much. The topics were great. I think, as Dr. Mukesh mentioned, part of the questions can be another lecture. But right now, we get the sense of that topic. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks a lot, Jonathan, Dr. Mukesh, Mr. Abdulkadir. Thanks a lot for coming. And another thanks to you to be patient for us. I know it's lunchtime. We're also thinking about lunch, but thanks again for coming up. Okay.
Çok teşekkürler. Sizleri yerinizde toplu fotoğraf çekmek için bir araya alacağız. Bir de bir plaketimiz olacak. Onu da siz takdim ederseniz
Tabii.
konuklarımıza çok